purpose of this video is to talk about lesson design when you are creating a reading lesson plan, including the teacher work sample format. So before we get started here, I just want to show you on the actual English Ed teacher work sample lesson plan template. This video is going to address what to put in this section, the lesson activities and instructional strategies section. So this section, we're going to zoom in here, and this is the bulk of your lesson plan because it includes what you're actually doing. So the step-by-step sequence of events of the lesson. What do you do when students first come in the room? Is there bell work? Is there whatever? Something to read on their desks? What do you do first? What do you do next? What are students doing? What do you assign for homework? Like, all of those things go here in this section. So this is actually your lesson itself, the lesson plan itself. So this is going to be rather large because it's going to include every single thing you do. Depending on, is it a mini lesson or is it a multiple day lesson or whatever. So we are zooming in just on this section. For an explanation of the other sections, there's a separate video for that you can find on Classroom. As well as there's a separate video for standards and objectives too. So we are only focusing here on designing the actual lesson. How do we decide what to do first, what to do next, how to wrap it up, etc. So every good lesson plan has a beginning, middle, and end. For a reading-based lesson plan, where the main thing you're asking students to do is to read a text, that you can sort of think of the beginning, middle, and end as the before reading, the during reading, and the after reading, right? So your lesson design will include, as key components, a strategy for each of those things. So here are some best practices for when we design a reading-based lesson plan. First of all, we use backwards design, and this is a best practice for really any type of lesson plan. We'll talk about backwards design in this presentation if you haven't heard about it before, or just as a refresher. Number two, best practice again for any type of lesson plan, but we know it's really impactful for a reading-based lesson plan, is your lesson plan needs to establish a purpose, and in this case, a purpose for reading. We've learned about why establishing purpose is so important to increasing student motivation, increasing student buy-in, helping students connect what they're learning to other things. And so establishing purpose is going to be something I'm looking for in these lesson plans too. Number three, another best practice is we got to intentionally incorporate comprehension support, and we got to make it explicit, meaning we have to name the strategies. We have to show students how to use the strategies. These things we've been practicing leading up to this. So your reading-based lesson plan, and I would say just about every reading-based lesson plan you do as a teacher is going to include intentional strategies done before, during, and after reading. And we know all the reasons why those are important. Number four, a best practice as you're thinking about your lesson plan is to maintain unity based around the goals that you have for the lesson or the standards. So I've said this before, but because this is an English class, of course we talk about other things. No matter what text we read, we usually talk about the characters because students respond to characters, right? Even if characterization isn't your key objective, you want to, and it's okay to, give space in your lesson plan for students to just respond and talk about the characters. But the strategies that you choose and the key objectives and the assessments that you choose and the formative assessments that you choose are mainly going to focus on whatever that objective is. So if your key objective is about inferencing, you probably want to try to choose a before reading, a during reading, and after reading that relates to that inferencing piece. Now, if it's a really complex text, again, as I've said before, you want to probably focus on comprehension as your main strategy piece. So your during reading strategy might be just finding key plot points if you have a really complex text. But again, you should base that on the text and also base that on your objectives, because you cannot accomplish any objective until they understand the text. So just basic comprehension is always a valid thing to focus on in your strategies if you have a very complex text. Number five, something students often forget when we do a standards-based lesson plan is your lesson plan still needs to prioritize space and leave space and have moments to just talk about what happened in the story, what did you think about what happened in the story, and what connections can you make to what happened in the story. No matter how complex your objective and your overall goal is, again, the first step is often just allowing students to process what they read, make sure they understand it, and make those connections. and have an emotional and a personal response to what they read. First of all, a little bit about backwards design. The overall concept of backwards design is to begin with the ending in mind. So what do you want them to get out of the reading? What is the skill, the habit that you're working on? Is it inferencing? Is it theme? Is it characterization? Is it figurative language? And then don't plan your lesson until you have a sense of that, because that, again, fits into the larger unit. But then the choices that you make from the very beginning of your lesson plan need to relate to that overall goal or objective. Sometimes in a literature or a text-based unit, students can feel like their brains are being pulled in multiple directions, but having that sense of focus and having everything sort of match that overall objective or goal is really important. I want to say too, not every reading lesson plan has to be standards-based. Some of them are about increasing empathy, right? So maybe you read a text because you want to increase students' empathy about people from different backgrounds. That's not really explicitly mentioned in the standards, but who cares? We know that's really important, right? That's a really important part of what we do as teachers. So that's valid too. But if it's about empathy, then you still need the matching, and you need to talk about empathy as part of your pre-reading, and you need to, that matching needs to exist regardless of whether it's standards-based or based on some literacy goals such as increasing empathy through reading. And then be intentional with those choices. So, choose each strategy based on, will this strategy help students comprehend the text and or achieve that goal or that learning objective that I have. So with backwards design, I'm over here now. We start by asking ourselves, what do I want the students to understand and know and be able to do? And then we craft our learning objectives based on that. But first, we say, or maybe next, we say, how will I know if they've gotten that out of the reading? How will I know if the reading allowed them to practice that skill? So if your learning objective turns out to be, we're working on inferencing, how will you know if students have successfully made inferences while or after reading? Well, you're going to think then about assessment evidence. So, I could do a quick little exit ticket where I ask them to include one inference they made. Or I could collect a graphic organizer. Or maybe we're going to have a discussion and I'm going to ask every student to share an inference they made and how they arrived at that inference, right? So first, what's the goal? How will I know if they've achieved that goal at the end of the lesson? How will I collect information about them, whether you're physically collecting a sheet of paper or just collecting, responses? And then how can I build the rest of the lesson around to lead them towards successful completion of the assessment evidence I've built into the lesson? So actually starting with the final piece that they're going to use to show you the learning has occurred successfully, and then building the rest of the lesson plan to lead them toward successful completion of that thing. We use the backwards design in unit planning as well, where our overall final unit test, project, paper, whatever it is, hits those key objectives, and then the whole unit should be designed to make sure they pass that test, or to make sure they can write that paper successfully, or to make sure that that project will be awesome and show the learning goals from every single student. So starting with the end in mind and then intentionally building the unit so that to successfully lead students toward completion of that assessment. Even if, as it will be on this lesson plan for us, even if that assessment piece is a formative assessment or a quick checkup. How can I make sure that the unit is, or that the lesson is structured and built and designed to lead them toward success of that objective? So here's what that might look like in a more detailed way, starting with the learning outcome and objective. In other words, what do I want students to get out of this? I want them to be able to, and I really like this because this is sort of that leveled, understand the function and then predict. So we're getting a little bit more in depth as far as depth of knowledge and complexity of thinking. So that's awesome. Here's how I'm going to test their learning over that. On the exam, there's this question, right? So maybe not even the whole exam because a unit has many different objectives, but this part of the project is going to assess whether they understand characterization, or this quick checkup at the end of a 2-day lesson plan is going to assess whether they understand characterization and can analyze a character. What activities then would lead students towards successful completion of that assessment? I'm going to have a lecture, I'm going to have a homework assignment, we're going to do an activity with Play-Doh, we're going to watch a video, like what things would we choose? Now that would be like a whole big unit, right? This is a unit plan. So for your lesson plan, you want to think, okay, I'm going to do a checkup over characterization. But to get them to that, I know I need to choose pre-reading that maybe I need to give a quick lesson on what characterization is, do a pre-reading strategy predicting things about the characters based on the first line, have them annotate important moments that show character development, or maybe put them on a chart with each character in a row. And then after reading strategy, I'm going to have a character chart, graphic organizer with a picture of the character, and they sort of put important moments on there, and then they discuss in partners. Okay, so your before, during, and after reading leads them towards successful completion of that assessment, the learning of the objective. And then I love this because alignment is where you check. You sort of self-assess. If you have a mentor teacher, a partner teacher, or a classmate, giving them a copy of your lesson plan and saying, is this aligned? Does it sort of match the objective? Does everything seem to fit? Alignment will be a key thing we talk about when we meet individually to talk about your lesson plans and what we need to do to revise them. One key thing we're looking at is alignment. It's pretty common. It's going to happen where I say, oh, this pre-reading seems to sort of pull students in a different direction. It doesn't really seem to flow well into your assessment piece, your formative assessment piece at the end. Could you modify it so it's a little more related to theme? Because it seems to be related to inferencing instead. So that alignment is a key thing we're looking for in a really thoughtfully designed lesson plan or unit plan. I want, though, to show you, sort of remind you that learning goal and the standard, and then breaking it down into the objective. So here's the process we used for that. Define theme, analyze characters in a text to identify a theme, relate a text theme to your own understanding of human nature. If these are my objectives, then you could think, how will I know that students have learned these skills? Oops, sorry for the train. How will I know that students have learned these skills? I could give a formative assessment or a quick checkup or a quick assignment. If I want them, how will I know if they've achieved that first objective, right? So this is thinking, what would that assessment piece be? Formative assessment in a 1 to 2 day lesson plan. I'm not going to collect any huge project or anything like that, but during the introductory lesson where I'm teaching them about theme and reminding them what theme is, I'm going to do a quick check of some sort. Don't really know what it is yet, but I need a plan to do a quick check, asking them if they can define theme in their own words after we've reviewed it. This is going to help me know if we're ready to move on to more complex learning. How will I know if students have learned how or gotten better at being able to analyze characters in a text to help them identify a theme? I think during reading, I'll have a graphic organizer that somehow relates to character analysis and then leads them toward theme. And then after reading, I want to focus my after reading questions on questions about the characters, and then sort of pulling them into thinking about how that suggests a theme to us in this story. So again, as I'm sort of modeling what the lesson design process might look like here, I have these vague ideas. I need to find a graphic organizer that will allow students to do this because I'm testing them, I'm assessing them over this, right? I know in my discussion, I need to ask questions that support their learning of this. So it's vague, but then in my actual design of the lesson, I have some sort of ideas of what types of strategies I need to find. Finally, students will be able to relate a text theme to their own understanding of human nature. That was my last stair-stepped objective there. I think that's the most complex level of thought, so that's where we're heading. That's like the overall goal of these stair-stepped objectives. So I need some sort of assessment at the end of the lesson where I'm asking students to do that. I think some sort of exit ticket will work well for that. I got to find or write an exit ticket that's asking them to do that. So Again, that was just sort of taking those stair-stepped objectives that you're going to have in your lesson plan, and then modeling how we can then ask ourselves, okay, how am I going to assess these using formative assessment throughout the lesson? It includes before, during, and after, and each objective, how am I going to assess it? So then I would sort of have a sense of purpose as I'm going out looking for the different strategies that I'm going to use, or activities, discussion questions, whatever else I'm going to include in the lesson plan. So I hope that was helpful for you. But I want to show you too the template that I have made. Now I made a note on Classroom. This is not a required assignment. You do not need to turn this in. I will not be collecting this for points. I'm happy to look at it as if you would like some feedback on the ideas that you have. In fact, I really recommend that you sort of fill this out and then share it with me and ask any questions you have via email before you submit your draft of your lesson plan or before you get started on that. So I've added here title, author, passage, and you can pull over your learning objectives. Now your learning objectives you don't list them here again because they're already here, but you got to keep them in mind as you're choosing different activities. So that's why I just included it here so it would be at the top of your mind. In the before reading section, there are many things, not just the strategy, but before you start reading the text, the beginning of the lesson plan will still include a greeting and some sort of engagement. These under here are ideas. Some of them are necessary ideas, and some of them are, it could include a bell work. So you don't have to do every single one of these bullet points. They're just reminders of things that you might do, and some of them I recommend you always do. Like you always want to name the strategy, but you could have a bell work here. How are you going to engage the class in the learning goal and objective? Maybe you're going to give an example they can relate to. You're going to state and display the objective. So you need to include what you're going to do or say for each of these things in your lesson plan. So this chunk of the lesson plan is going to be highly detailed. You may also need a content lesson. We usually do. If your objective is theme, you got to review theme, okay? Because students, even though they've learned it since 4th grade, 3rd grade, and they've talked about it 100 times, they need to review theme. And it'll be like it's brand new to like half the class, even though you've talked about it. Or they're going to have misconceptions. They might think theme is something else, right? So you always got to review the content before you go. You may also want to or need to provide some background information. Maybe you got to say something about Edgar Allan Poe. Keep it brief. We don't need it to be a huge, gigantic, it's not the key focus. Give us a little background information on the era from which the literature comes from or whatever, right? So content lesson is often going to be a part of this, just to give students a little bit of information that they need. You're going to do a pre-reading strategy, right? And so we know that these things make the pre-reading strategy work well. You're going to have all of that planned in. We got to transition to the text. We might provide background here, or we might do it here. So keep that in mind. You don't have to go through this in the exact order in your actual lesson plan. You could do it wherever you do it. In the during reading section, you're going to have the during reading strategy as the main thing happening. You want to note too, what are you doing while they're reading? So that's always really important part of your lesson plan design. What are students doing and what are you doing? Then you're probably going to wrap up day 1 because most of these texts are large enough that you won't be able to read them within one lesson plan or within one day, even if you're on block schedule. So you might ask them to finish reading it, or you might come back the next day and finish reading it as a class, or give time to finish reading it as a class. So I just noted here, you still have to include how you're going to wrap up day 1. You don't just want the bell to ring and off they go. You want to plan to end their reading time with a few minutes to wrap it up, reflect, talk about what you want them to do as they continue to read the text, or maybe talk about how far everybody got, what's happened so far, what do you think of this, something like that. Day 2, you got to start all over with a whole new greeting, right? They're coming back. So what are you going to do to re-engage the class? Are you going to review theme again? Are you going to review the strategy instructions? So we got to see this too. And then after reading, I left space here because your after reading strategy might be a little more complex. Don't forget to leave time for students to reflect, respond, check for comprehension, all those things. Again, you want to keep it sort of brief. You don't want it to be its whole gigantic own thing, its own gigantic strategy, but you want to leave some time for just processing as a class, processing in groups, or whatever you can think of to do there. And or then your after reading strategy, if your after reading strategy doesn't already support these first step types of things. I've included here for you as well, what's your formative assessment or checkup? How are you going to make sure that they have gotten good practice in that final complex objective, with some ideas there for you. And then closure. So students always need to know what was important about what you just did, reinforce key ideas, review key terms, make connections to other learning, or sort of preview what would be coming up next. So I want to see some nice closure moments there too. So I recommend you use this, and hopefully it will be helpful to you in the future as well. This is how I think about a lesson plan. Even if I don't write out all of these things, I think about it in the same way. So it sort of comes from my brain and my experience planning lessons. So that might be helpful to you. You won't then take this and copy and paste it in here. What this will look like is sort of a list. So you would say bell work. When students enter, the board will say blah, 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 blah. And then step 1. First, we will review the term theme. I will write it on the board, and students will ... right? Then we will, students will, maybe step 2 is going to be like a think, pair, share, right? So I would say think, pair, share. Project the question. So sort of outline format, right, is what we're looking for here with each of the steps. What are you going to do first, second, and third? One thing we'll spend time talking about in our conferences is chunks that seem to be missing, like, oh, you never talked about that. So for now, this could be pretty skeletal because it's going to be a first draft, and we will work on filling in the skeleton as we talk about things that we can do to revise for matching or for flow or other things. So I hope this is a helpful tool for you as we're getting our feet under ourselves for how to plan these detailed reading lessons. Let me know if you have any questions as always. Bye.